The Mockingbird Saloon sat quiet as sunset painted Redemption's Main Street gold. 3 men, trail-worn and dangerous, pushed through the swinging doors, bringing the stink of prison with them. Behind the bar, the owner kept polishing a glass, eyes down, movements precise. "Hey, barkeep!" The tallest prisoner slammed a filthy hand on worn wood. "Ain't you got no manners? Man asks for service, proper things to look him in the eye." The owner continued his methodical cleaning, each circular motion perfect, unhurried. The second prisoner laughed. "Maybe he's simple. Heard some folks go soft out here, all alone with their—" He stopped, squinting at the owner's hands. Something about those calluses, that steady grip. "Wait," the third man whispered, face draining of color. "I know who this is. Boys, we just made a terrible mistake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." 12 hours earlier, Thomas Silent Tom Hawkins started each day the same way he had for the past 5 years. Up before dawn, check the saloon's windows and doors, sweep the porch, and polish the bar until the worn wood gleamed like honey in morning light. Every motion efficient, precise, born of routine and something deeper, a discipline most barkeeps didn't possess. The Mockingbird was more than just Redemption's only saloon. It served as the town's heartbeat, its gathering place, its unofficial town hall. Tom knew every creak in its floorboards, every scratch in its tables, every story its walls had witnessed. He also knew exactly how many steps it took to reach any point in the room, how many seconds it would take to cross from the bar to each exit, and which tables offered the best views of both doors. Old habits. He was arranging bottles behind the bar when Mary Chen arrived with fresh bread for the day's lunch service. At 16, she was the youngest of the Chen family that ran Redemption's general store, and the only person in town who seemed immune to Tom's quiet nature. "Morning, Mr. Hawkins." She set the basket on the bar, the scent of fresh-baked sourdough filling the air. "Pa says the supply wagon's running late this week. Might not get those coffee beans you ordered until Friday." Tom nodded, reaching for his notepad. His preferred method of communication. "No rush, still have enough." "You know," Mary continued, undaunted by his written response, "most folks wonder why you don't talk. But I figured it out." She grinned. "You're just saving up all your words for something important." Tom's hand paused briefly in its writing, a tell so subtle only someone trained to notice such things would catch it. But his response was smooth. "Smart girl. Deputy Carter was asking about you yesterday," Mary added, arranging the bread loaves. "Said she might stop by later, something about strange tracks out by Miller's Creek." Tom's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked to the window, scanning the street with practiced casualness. Deputy Sarah Carter was new to her badge, but she had good instincts. If she'd noticed something concerning, the day proceeded with its usual rhythm. Regular customers drifted in and out, ranch hands grabbing lunch, miners taking breaks from the nearby silver operation, travelers passing through on their way to larger towns. Tom served drinks, wiped tables, and kept his eyes and ears open, just as he had every day since buying the Mockingbird. It was a good life, quiet and predictable. Everything he'd wanted when he'd left his old one behind. But there were signs if you knew how to look, the way he never stood in front of windows, how his right hand stayed free even when carrying multiple glasses, the locked drawer under the bar that no one had ever seen opened, and there was the mirror. Most saloons had one behind the bar. It was practically tradition, but Tom's was slightly angled, offering a perfect view of both the front and back entrances. Not that any casual observer would notice, just like they wouldn't notice how he tensed slightly whenever the swing doors opened, or how he tracked every patron's hands, or how he knew exactly who was armed in his establishment at any given moment. Old habits died hard after all. By mid-afternoon, the lunch crowd had thinned. Tom was doing inventory, his neat handwriting filling the ledger, when Sheriff Mills stepped in. The lawman's face was drawn, worried in a way Tom hadn't seen before. "Got news from Carson City," Mills said without preamble. "Prison break. 3 men. Headed this direction according to the wire." Tom kept writing in his ledger, his penmanship perfect and unhurried. "Thing is," Mills continued, watching Tom carefully, "one of them's Jake the Snake Martinez. Name mean anything to you?" Tom's pencil paused for just a fraction of a second. Another tell so subtle most would miss it. Then he turned his notepad toward the sheriff. "Should it?" Mills sighed. "Reckon that depends on who's doing the asking. Just keep your eyes open, Tom. These men, they're dangerous, and they might have reasons to pass through redemption." Tom nodded, picked up his cleaning rag, and resumed polishing the already spotless bar. Mills watched him for a moment longer, then headed out, boot heels clicking on wooden floorboards. Alone again, Tom's hand drifted to that locked drawer under the bar. He didn't open it, hadn't opened it in 5 years, but his fingers traced its outline, feeling the key that hung on a chain around his neck press against his chest. Old habits, old memories, old ghosts. Some things you could run from, some things you could bury. And some things, no matter how deep you buried them, had a way of clawing their way back to the surface. Tom resumed his polishing, movements precise, expression unchanged. But his eyes, reflected in that carefully angled mirror, had taken on a hardness that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew the quiet barkeep of the Mockingbird Saloon. News of the prison break spread through Redemption like wildfire in dry grass. By mid-afternoon, the Mockingbird had filled with townspeople swapping rumors and fears. Tom served drinks with his usual efficiency, each movement controlled and precise, while conversations swirled around him. "Heard they killed 2 guards getting out," Frank Miller, the silver mine foreman, announced to his table. "Just snapped their necks quiet-like, no shots fired." "That ain't the worst," Pete Chen, Mary's father, added in low tones. "Sheriff Mills told me Martinez. He's got a history round these parts. Used to run with the Collins gang before they caught him." The Collins gang. Tom's hand didn't shake as he poured whiskey, but something cold settled in his stomach. 5 years was a long time, but not long enough to forget that name. Deputy Sarah Carter entered, bringing the smell of horse and trail dust. She was young for a deputy, but her eyes carried the sharp awareness of someone who'd grown up fast. She caught Tom's gaze and moved to the bar. "Mr. Hawkins," she said quietly, "found something out by Miller's Creek you should know about. 3 sets of tracks heading into town. One horse was favoring its left front leg, same as the description. Carson City scent of the Mount Martinez stole." Tom pulled out his notepad. "How far? Few hours, maybe less. They're trying to be careful, staying off the main trails, but they're pushing their horses hard." She hesitated. "Sheriff Mills, he says you might have history with these men, that maybe you're not just—" Tom's pencil scratched across paper. "Just a barkeep." Sarah studied him, and he saw in her eyes the same calculating intelligence that had made him recommend her for the deputy position when Mills had been looking. Yes, she was young, but she noticed things, like how a quiet barkeep somehow knew enough about law work to suggest promising deputies. "Mills won't tell me the whole story," she said finally. "Says it ain't his to tell, but these men, they're killers, and they're heading straight for redemption. If there's something I should know." Tom wrote carefully, "Everyone has a past." "Yes, sir, but not everyone's past rides into town carrying guns and murder charges." Before Tom could respond, the saloon's doors swung open. Conversation died as Sheriff Mills entered, his face grim. He crossed to the bar, ignoring the questioning looks from the patrons. "Just got another wire," he said quietly. "They hit a way station 30 miles out. Left a man dead." He paused. "Tom, they asked about redemption. Specifically asked if we had a saloon. Tom's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked to the mirror, scanning the room with practiced ease. The afternoon crowd watched anxiously, trying to pretend they weren't listening to every word. "Lot of towns have saloons," Sarah pointed out. "Not like this one," Mills replied. "Not with—" He caught himself, glancing at Tom. Tom wrote quickly, "You should get the women and children to the church. Defensible position. Single entrance." Mills read the note, then crumpled it in his fist. "Damn it, Tom. This is exactly what I was afraid of. They're not just passing through, are they? They're hunting." Tom's next note was simple. "Yes. Then maybe it's time you opened that drawer under the bar," Mills suggested quietly. "The one you think nobody knows about." Tom's hand drifted to the key around his neck, and for a moment, something passed behind his eyes, a shadow of the man he'd been before he was Silent Tom the barkeep. Sarah watched this exchange with growing understanding. "You're not just someone who knows about law work," she said softly. "You were law." Tom wrote nothing, but his silence was answer enough. The saloon had gone completely quiet now, everyone watching this exchange. In 5 years, no one had learned much about the quiet man who ran the Mockingbird. He was fair with his prices, kept a clean establishment, and minded his own business. But now, looking at how he stood behind his bar, balanced, alert, every movement efficient, they began to see something else, something that had always been there if they'd known how to look. "Tom," Mills said finally, "if you're who I think you are, if you're who they're really looking for, these people deserve to know what's riding toward their town." Tom studied the sheriff for a long moment. Then, movements deliberate, he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. The scratching of his pencil was the only sound in the suddenly tense saloon, as 5 years of carefully maintained silence prepared to break. Tom's pencil moved across paper with the same precision he brought to everything. When he finished, he didn't immediately show what he'd written. Instead, he reached beneath his collar and pulled out the key he always wore. The entire saloon seemed to hold its breath as he opened the drawer that had remained locked for 5 years. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with the stamp of the U.S. Marshal's office. Tom placed it on the bar in front of Mills, then slid his newly written note beside it. Mills read Tom's note first. "Read it. They should know what's coming." The sheriff broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his voice carrying in the silent saloon. "To all law enforcement personnel, this document confirms the retirement of U.S. Marshal Thomas Hawkins, effective immediately. In his 15 years of service, Marshal Hawkins has demonstrated unparalleled dedication to justice with a record of 117 successful arrests, 42 recovered stolen shipments, and the complete dismantling of the Collins gang. Special commendation is noted for his final operation, which resulted in the arrest of Jake Martinez and the recovery of stolen Army payroll, though at great personal cost. Marshal Hawkins's decision to retire following injury and the loss of his voice in the line of duty is a profound loss to the service. His request for anonymity and retirement is granted, with all records sealed. Mills looked up from the letter. The quiet barkeep. It was the perfect cover, wasn't it? Who'd look for a legendary marshal in a man who never speaks, Tom wrote. Needed peace. Found it here. Until now, Sarah said quietly. Martinez. He was part of the Collins gang? The ones you brought down? Tom nodded, then wrote, Last arrest. Bullet caught me in the throat. Survived. Voice didn't. The saloon erupted in whispers. Everyone knew the story of the Collins gang, how they'd terrorized 3 territories before a mysterious marshal had infiltrated and destroyed them from within, how their final shootout had become legend. Sweet Jesus, Frank Miller breathed. We've had the ghost marshal serving us drinks for 5 years. Tom's expression tightened at the old nickname. He wrote quickly, That man is dead. No, Mills countered. That man has been hiding. Question is, what happens when Martinez and his boys ride into town? Because they're not coming for the ghost marshal. They're coming for blood. Tom's next note was longer. Moving into position by sunset, using my saloon as bait. Need everyone clear of Main Street by then. Sarah, get families to church. Mills, cover back exit. I'll handle the rest. Handle it how? Sarah demanded. There's 3 of them, all killers. Tom's response was simple. Been waiting 5 years. Drawer had more than just a letter. He reached into the drawer again and withdrew a gun belt. The leather was well-oiled despite years of storage, the twin Colts gleaming, with the dull sheen of regular maintenance. Everyone stared. They'd never seen Tom wear a gun, never even suspected he owned one. Ghost Marshal, Frank whispered again. They used to say he was the fastest drawer in 3 territories, that if you saw him reach for iron, you were already dead. Tom strapped on the guns with practiced ease, the movements automatic despite the years. The familiar weight settled at his hips, and something changed in his posture, subtle but unmistakable. The quiet barkeep seemed to fade away, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. He wrote one final note: "Get everyone out. When they come, they'll find what they're looking for." The ghost marshal, Sarah said softly, understanding finally dawning. They called you that because you could appear anywhere, strike without warning, vanish again. Because if you were hunting someone... Tom finished her thought in writing. They were already caught. They just didn't know it yet. Mills gathered the townsfolk, directing them towards safety, while Tom began methodically rearranging his saloon. Every table placement, every chair angle was positioned with tactical precision. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as he worked, marking the approach of what everyone now knew would be a violent sunset. Sarah lingered at the door. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, then corrected herself. "Marshal, will you be—" Tom looked up from his preparations, met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled. It was not the smile of a quiet barkeep. It was the smile of a predator, long dormant, finally given permission to hunt again. The deputy nodded, understanding. As she left, Tom returned to his position behind the bar, cleaning a glass with the same methodical care he always showed. But now everyone knew. Those precise movements, that careful attention to detail, they weren't the habits of a simple barkeep. They were the disciplines of a legend, honed by years of hunting the worst the West had to offer. And now, after 5 years of peace, the ghost marshal was about to remind 3 escaped prisoners exactly why his name had once made outlaws tremble. Tom kept polishing his glass, waiting for sunset, knowing that sometimes the deadliest predator was the one that waited quietly behind the bar, watching in the mirror, ready to remind desperate men why some ghosts should stay buried. The sun hung low over Redemption's main street, painting the empty boardwalks in shades of blood and gold. Tom watched through his carefully angled mirror as 3 riders approached from the east, their horses moving slowly, deliberately. Even at a distance, he recognized Jake Martinez's distinctive slouch in the saddle. 5 years hadn't changed him much, still wore his gun belt too low, still favored his right side, old wound from a shot Tom had put in him during the Collins gangs. Last stand. The other 2 were unknowns, prison friends probably, but their body language told Tom everything he needed to know. Killers, both of them, used to violence and enjoying it. They dismounted with the careful movements of men expecting trouble, but their swagger as they approached the saloon suggested they weren't expecting enough. Tom kept polishing his glass, maintaining the persona of Silent Tom, the barkeep, for just a few moments longer. The doors swung open, boots scuffed across wooden floorboards, Martinez slightly dragging his right leg, another old gift from their last meeting. Tom didn't look up, But in the mirror, he tracked every movement, every position, every subtle tell that would telegraph their first moves. Well, well, Martinez's voice carried the same oily confidence it had 5 years ago. Heard this was the only saloon in town. Didn't expect to find such an interesting barkeep. Tom kept polishing, his movements unhurried. Let them get comfortable, let them think they had control. Old habits, old tactics, sliding back into place like well-oiled gears. You boys notice something odd? Martinez continued, moving toward the bar. Town's awful quiet, almost like... He grinned, revealing a gold tooth that glinted in the fading sunlight. Almost like someone knew we were coming. The other two spread out, taking positions that might have been tactical if they'd recognized the angles Tom had created with his careful furniture arrangement. Every sightline covered, every possible position of advantage already calculated and countered. "Hey!" The larger of Martinez's companions slammed a hand on the bar. "My friend's talking to you, mute. Ain't you got no manners?" Tom finally looked up, meeting Martinez's eyes in the mirror. Recognition flickered there, followed by something that might have been fear before being buried under bravado. "Been a long time," Martinez said softly. 5 years, 2 months, and 13 days. Counted every one of them in that cell you put me in." He moved closer to the bar, hand dropping casually toward his gun. "Heard what happened after, how that bullet caught you just right, stole your voice." His smile widened. "Poetic, ain't it? The Ghost Marshal, legendary for appearing out of nowhere, striking without warning, reduced to serving drinks in silence." Tom set his glass down carefully, precisely, giving Martinez one last chance to recognize the danger he was in. But the outlaw was too focused on his perceived advantage, too eager for revenge to see the trap he'd walked into. "Boys," Martinez announced, "I do believe we've found ourselves the perfect opportunity for some justice of our own. After all..." His hand settled on his gun butt. "Man can't very well be a legend if he can't even talk." The next few seconds would decide everything. Tom could see all the pieces falling into place. Martinez's weight shifted slightly forward, telegraphing his draw, while his companions moved to what they thought were flanking positions, not realizing they'd stepped exactly where Tom had planned for them to be. 5 years of peace, 5 years of quiet, 5 years of being just a barkeep, time to remind them why they called him the Ghost. Time seemed to slow in the Mockingbird Saloon, the fading sunlight stretching shadows across worn floorboards. Martinez's finger twitched. The tell he'd never corrected, the same one that had gotten him caught 5 years ago. Tom's hands remained, relaxed at his sides, but every muscle was coiled, ready. "You know what I learned in prison?" Martinez's voice dripped with false casualness. "Learned that legends don't mean much inside 4 walls. Learned that even ghosts can bleed." His smile turned ugly. "Learned that watching someone who hurt you suffer, that's better than killing them quick." The larger companion moved closer to the bar. "What you thinking, Jake? Make him watch while we burn his precious saloon down around him?" "Oh, we'll get there," Martinez assured him. "But first..." He drew his gun in a flash of movement that would have been impressive against anyone else. "First, we remind him what it feels like to be helpless." Tom didn't move, didn't reach for his guns, just stood, watching in the mirror, letting decades of experience calculate angles and trajectories. Martinez's shot would go wide right. He always pulled under pressure. The big one was favoring his left foot, slowing his draw. The third man had positioned himself perfectly in line with the hanging lamp that would shatter when Tom moved. "Nothing to say?" Martinez taunted, then laughed at his own joke. "Course not. Ghost Marshal's just a mute barkeep now. Bet you wish. You'd killed me back then, instead of trying to bring me in proper." Tom's only response was to reach slowly for his notepad. The movement drew everyone's attention, exactly as intended. Martinez's gun followed his hand. Another mistake. Never take your eyes off a ghost's whole body. Write your last words careful, Martinez sneered. Want folks to be able to read 'em when they find what's left. Tom's pencil moved across paper. With deliberate precision, he turned the notepad around, letting them read, "You still pull your shots right." Martinez's face contorted in rage. His finger tightened on the trigger, and everything happened at once. The lamp shattered, plunging, half the room into shadow. Tom moved with the liquid grace of a man who had never really stopped being what he was. His first shot caught Martinez's gun, sending it spinning. His second dropped the big man before he could clear leather. The third shattered a bottle behind the third outlaw's head, showing he could have killed him but chose not to. All in less than 2 seconds. Martinez clutched his stinging hand, face pale, with the realization of what he'd walked into. His remaining companion stood frozen, blood draining from his face as he finally understood why they called him the Ghost Marshal. Tom wrote another note. Movements unhurried. You have 2 choices. You can't, Martinez stammered. The Ghost Marshal retired, went soft. 5 years of pouring drinks. Tom's next note cut him off. 5 years of practicing. Every motion, every angle, every possible scenario. Outside, Sheriff Mills' voice carried clearly, "Buildings surrounded, boys. Ghost Marshal's already shown mercy by not killing you all. I suggest you take the offer he's about to make." Tom's final note was simple. Surrender now. Live to see prison again. Or he didn't need to finish the thought. They had all heard the stories. All knew what happened to those who pushed the Ghost Marshal too far. How they never saw the shots coming, never had a chance to defend themselves. Martinez slowly raised his hands. "I surrender," he said, voice shaking. "I choose prison." Tom nodded once, then wrote, "Wise choice. Some ghosts should stay buried." As Mills and Deputy Carter moved in to take the prisoners, Tom calmly began picking up the broken glass from his floor. To anyone watching, he was just a barkeep again, tidying his saloon. But they all knew now. The Ghost Marshal had never really retired. He'd just been waiting, watching, ready to remind those who needed reminding why some legends are best left alone. Dawn found Tom behind his bar again, cleaning glasses with the same methodical care he always showed. But now, everyone saw the precision of those movements differently. What they had taken for a barkeep's attention to detail, they now recognized as a lawman's discipline, maintained through 5 years of silent vigilance. Deputy Carter entered first, bringing the morning's first coffee delivery herself, instead of letting Mary Chen make the usual run. Her eyes went immediately to the fresh bullet holes in the wall, then to where Tom had already repaired the broken lamp. "Martinez is talking," she said without preamble. "Won't shut up, actually. Keeps going on about the Collins gang, about some in payroll robbery that went wrong." She set the coffee down. "Says there's more to the story than what's in that marshal's letter." Tom's hands didn't pause in their work, but his eyes met hers in the mirror. He reached for his notepad. "Usually is. He claims the army payroll was never recovered. Says that's why you really retired. Not because of the injury, but because you couldn't face failing." She watched him carefully. "Says there's still 200,000 in gold, buried somewhere, waiting for the right people to claim it." Tom wrote, "Martinez always did like stories. This one's got army investigators interested. They're riding in from Fort Laramie." She hesitated. "Tom, Marshal, whatever you want to be called. If there's something I should know." Tom's next note was longer, stories simple. "Collins' gang hit the payroll wagon. I infiltrated, brought them down. Money was never found. Some mysteries stay mysteries. And your voice, that part true at least." His hand drifted to his throat, where a thin scar was visible if you knew to look for it. "Collins figured out what I was. Shot didn't kill me. Close. Thing. The saloon's doors swung open as Sheriff Mills entered, looking like he hadn't slept. "Got more coming in from Carson City," he announced. "Not just army investigators. Seems Martinez's escape stirred up old ghosts. Collins' gang survivors are getting restless." Tom's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. He wrote, "How many? 3 former members released in the last year, all heading this way." Mills ran a hand through his grey hair. "Tom, level with me. That payroll robbery. There was more to it, wasn't there? Something that never made the official reports." Tom was still for a long moment, then wrote carefully, "Collins' gang wasn't just outlaws. Had connections, high-up ones, army officers, politicians. Some mysteries stay buried for good reasons." "Jesus," Sarah breathed. "That's why you chose here, isn't it? Quiet town, middle of nowhere, but with clear lines of sight to all approaching trails. You weren't just hiding, you were watching, waiting." Tom nodded slowly. His next note confirmed what they'd begun to suspect. "Knew someday old business would surface. Chose my ground. Prepared." 5 years, Mills said softly. 5 years of serving. Drinks, keeping quiet, maintaining your cover, all while knowing this day might come." He shook his head in admiration. "Ghost Marshal indeed." Tom wrote, "Town needs to be ready. Collins' gang survivors, army investigators, old wounds opening, storms coming." Sarah straightened, hand unconsciously checking her gun. "Then we prepare. You've protected this town for 5 years without anyone knowing. Now it's our turn to stand. With you." Tom's response was quick, dangerous. "These men," Mills cut him off. "These men think they're hunting a ghost. Let's show them they've found an army instead." Tom studied them both, seeing the determination in their eyes. Finally, he wrote, "Need to tell you the whole story then, about the payroll, the conspiracies. The real reason they called me the Ghost Marshal." He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and for the first time in 5 years began to write the full truth of what had happened during his last mission, about betrayals in high places, about corruption that reached into the heart of the army itself, and about why some ghosts refused to stay buried. The truth, as always, was deadlier than any legend. Sarah Carter had become a deputy because of her father. He'd been a lawman in Kansas, gunned down by cattle rustlers when she was 12. She still wore his badge on a chain around her neck, a reminder of why she'd chosen this path. But now, reading Tom's account of the Collins gang conspiracy, she realized how naive her understanding of justice had been. General Harrison? She looked up from the pages in disbelief. The commander of Fort Laramie was working with the Collins gang. Tom nodded, writing, "Why the money was never found." Harrison arranged the payroll shipment, planned the robbery, used Collins as cover. "But you figured it out," Mills said, studying the precisely written pages. "That's why they tried to kill you, not because you were a marshal, but because you discovered how deep it went." "Harrison still commands Fort Laramie." Tom wrote, "Army investigators coming." Probably his men. Sarah's hand tightened on her father's badge. "So when they get here, not coming to investigate, coming to bury truth deeper." The saloon's morning quiet took on a heavier quality as they absorbed the implications. Tom continued, writing, laying out the full scope of what they faced. Collins gang survivors want revenge. Army men want secrets buried. Local ranchers getting pressured to sell land cheap. All connected. The land sales, Sarah straightened. "That's what I've been investigating. 3 ranches sold in the past month, all to shell companies. I couldn't trace the buyers, but..." She met Tom's eyes. "It's Harrison, isn't it? Using intermediaries to buy up land around redemption." Tom's next note confirmed her suspicion. Building empire away from Fort, using old Collins connections. Martinez's escape, no accident. "Jesus," Mills breathed. 5 years ago, you didn't just retire, you positioned yourself here. Knew they'd eventually try to expand into this territory, chose ground, prepared defenses, waited. Sarah studied the quiet man behind the bar with new understanding. "You've been gathering evidence all this time, haven't you? Every land sale, every suspicious transaction, every connection to Fort Laramie." Tom reached beneath the bar and produced a second notebook, this one filled with 5 years of careful observations. Names, dates, property transfers, all meticulously documented. In his precise handwriting, evidence wasn't enough before. General, too powerful, needed them to make mistake. Martinez, Sarah understood. His escape, his coming here. You knew it would draw attention, force things into the open. Tom's smile held no humor. Ghost's greatest weapon. Patience, Mills whistled softly. "So that's the real play. You're not just defending the town from revenge-seeking outlaws. You're finally finishing what you started 5 years ago. Town will be in danger," Tom wrote. "Harrison's men, Collins' gang survivors, all converging. Could leave, take evidence elsewhere. Like hell." Sarah's voice carried her father's steel. "This is our home. If Harrison wants to build his corrupt empire here, he'll find more than one ghost waiting." She pulled her father's badge from beneath, her shirt, studying it in the morning light. "Dad always said being a lawman wasn't about the gun on your hip. It was about standing between good folks and those who'd harm them. Don't matter if those threats wear outlaw rags or army uniforms." Tom studied her for a long moment, then wrote, "Remind me of myself. Young, idealistic, ready to face odds. Did those qualities serve you well as the ghost marshal?" His response was careful. "Got me shot, lost my voice, but saved lives. Stopped corruption. Worth the price." Mills cleared his throat. "Army investigators will be here by sunset. Collins. Gang survivors probably not far behind. We need to be ready." Tom nodded, writing quickly. "Sarah, check defensive positions. Mills, get deputies prepared. I'll contact old friends." "Old friends?" Sarah asked. "Other marshals, ones who suspected Harrison but couldn't prove it. Time to call in favors." "And Martinez?" Mills asked. "What do we do with him?" Tom's final note. "Carried deadly certainty. Keep him alive. When Harrison's men come to silence him, they'll prove everything." Sarah checked her gun, feeling the weight of her father's badge against her chest. She'd become a deputy to continue his legacy of protecting the innocent. Now she was about to help the legendary Ghost Marshal expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the army. Her father would have been proud. Tom watched her go, recognizing the determination in her stance. She was young, idealistic, ready to face impossible odds. Everything he'd been before a bullet stole his voice and drove him into hiding. But this time, the ghost wouldn't be hunting alone. By midday, Redemption had transformed from a quiet frontier town into an armed camp. Tom watched from his carefully positioned mirror as townspeople moved with purpose, following Sarah's directions to reinforce buildings and establish defensive positions. His notepad had been busy, sketching detailed instructions that drew on years of experience in siege situations. The first sign of trouble came from Mary Chen, rushing into the saloon with fear in her eyes. "Riders coming," she gasped, "but not from Fort Laramie. These came from the south." Tom's hands moved quickly across paper. "How many?" "Describe them." 6 men, all wearing black dusters. One had a silver star pinned to his chest, but... She hesitated. "Mr. Hawkins, it didn't look like any lawman's badge I've ever seen." Tom's expression darkened. He wrote, "Get Mills and Sarah. Now." While Mary ran to fetch them, Tom pulled out another notebook from beneath the bar. This one contained sketches, detailed drawings of badges and insignias, both legitimate and fraudulent. He found the page. He wanted just as Mills and Sarah entered. "Harrison's private militia," he wrote. "Use fake badges. Pretend to be law. Really hired killers." "Jesus," Mills muttered. "How many of these notebooks do you have? How long have you been preparing for this?" Tom's response was grim. 5 years. documented everything: Harrison's men, Collins' gang connections, land grabs across 3 territories. Sarah studied the sketched badges. "That's why you recommended me for deputy, isn't it? You knew this was coming. Needed someone you could trust with a badge when it did. Watched you investigate land sales. Saw potential, like looking in mirror from 15 years ago." The doors swung open as Pete Chen entered, his normally cheerful face tight with worry. "Those riders, they're stopping at every business on Main Street, asking questions about Martinez, about the shooting last night." He lowered his voice. "About the ghost marshal." Tom nodded as if this was expected. His next note was quick. Harrison moving faster than anticipated, sending cleaners before official investigators. "Cleaners?" Sarah asked. Mills's face was grim. "Professional killers. They come in, eliminate witnesses, make problems disappear. Had them in Kansas territory during the war. Worse than regular outlaws, because they've got official backing." Tom was already writing, "Need to accelerate plan." Sarah, "Get Martinez moved to secondary location." Mills, "Spread word. When riders ask questions, no one knows anything." But before they could move, heavy boot steps sounded on the porch. Tom smoothly slid his notebooks out of sight, resuming his quiet barkeep demeanor as the doors swung open. The man who entered wore his black duster-like armor, the silver star on his chest catching the light. His smile was practiced, professional, and never reached his eyes. 5 equally dangerous-looking men spread out behind him. "Good afternoon." The leader's voice carried the cultured accent of an educated man. "I'm Chief Inspector Wesley, Army Criminal Investigations." He produced papers that looked official to anyone who hadn't spent 5 years studying such documents. "We're looking into last night's disturbance. Mind if we ask a few questions?" Tom maintained his simple barkeep facade, but his eyes caught Sarah's in the mirror, a subtle warning. She'd been about to challenge the man's credentials, but Tom's look stopped her. Let them think they had the advantage. Wesley approached the bar, studying Tom with calculated intensity. "Interesting. Setup you have here. Mirror position just so. Clear views of all entrances. Almost like..." His smile widened slightly, almost like someone with tactical experience arranged it. Tom reached for his notepad, playing his role. "Just a barkeep. Like to keep eye on trouble." "Of course," Wesley agreed smoothly. "Simple precaution. Though I hear last night's trouble was handled with rather professional expertise. 3 armed men disabled without a single fatality. Remarkable restraint for a simple barkeep." Tom kept his expression neutral, but his hands stayed in sight on the bar. In the mirror, he could see Wesley's men positioning themselves around the saloon, except they weren't taking tactical positions. They were stepping exactly where Tom had planned for overconfident men to step. Some traps work best when the prey thinks they're the hunter. Wesley's interrogation continued with the precision of a well-honed blade. Each question seemed innocent enough, but Tom recognized the technique. He'd used it himself in his martial days. Build a picture piece by piece, watching for the tells. That revealed hidden truth. "Interesting thing about the shots fired," Wesley mused, fingers trailing along the bar's polished surface. "Perfect placement. 1 to disarm, 1 to disable, 1 to warn. Almost like..." His eyes met Tom's in the mirror. Almost like someone was sending a message. Tom wrote simply, "Lucky shots," was scared. Lucky indeed. Wesley smiled that cold smile again. "Mind if my men check your establishment? Standard procedure in shooting investigations." Tom gestured acquiescence, watching in the mirror as the men began their search. They were good, professional in their movements, thorough in their inspection. But they missed the signs that would have been obvious to anyone who really knew what to look for. The slightly uneven floorboard that concealed Tom's most damning evidence. The hollow space behind the bar's wooden panels. The secondary triggers. He'd spent 5 years positioning. The saloon's doors swung open again, and a trail-worn man stumbled in. His clothes were dusty, his face shadowed by a week's growth of beard. But Tom's eyes narrowed slightly. The dust was too evenly distributed, the beard too carefully unkempt. "Sorry," the newcomer slurred, playing the role of a drunk perfectly. "Just need a drink. Long ride from Fort Laramie." Wesley's men tensed, but their leader raised a hand, studying the stranger. "Fort Laramie, you say, recently stationed there?" "Was." The man collapsed onto a bar stool. "Till General Harrison's new policies made honest soldiering impossible. Had to quit. Saw too much." Tom kept his face neutral, but his mind raced. He recognized the man now, Captain James Cooper, one of the few honest officers at Fort Laramie. They'd corresponded in secret over the years, sharing information about Harrison's activities. His appearance now was no coincidence. Wesley's interest sharpened. "What kind of things did you see, friend?" Cooper took a long drink from the whiskey Tom served him, playing his part perfectly. "Shipments that didn't match manifests, orders that didn't make sense. And that business with the Collins gang payroll." He shook his head, never did believe the official story about that. Tom saw Wesley's men exchange glances. This wasn't part of their script. Cooper was introducing variables they hadn't planned. "For the payroll robbery." Wesley's casual tone had an edge now. "Ancient history, surely." "Maybe." Cooper stared into his glass. "But funny thing about that money. 200,000 in gold, never recovered. Yet 6 months later, Harrison starts buying up land through shell companies, using cash that ain't Army issued." Wesley's smile had become fixed. "Careful, friend. Some stories are dangerous to tell. All stories are dangerous to someone." Cooper's drunk act slipped slightly, revealing steel beneath. Like the story of why Harrison's really pushing west, why he needs this territory so bad. Ever wonder about that, Inspector? The title carried just enough emphasis to make it clear. He knew it was fake. Tom watched the tension build, saw Wesley's men shift their positions. They were trained killers, used to solving problems with violence. But Cooper was deliberately public, deliberately visible. They couldn't simply make him disappear without drawing attention. "Perhaps," Wesley said carefully, "we should continue this discussion somewhere more private." Cooper smiled, and Tom recognized the expression, the same one he'd worn himself, when springing a trap. "Oh, I don't think so. See, I've already sent copies of everything I know to 3 different newspaper offices. Any accident befalls me, any mysterious disappearance," he shrugged. "Whole story comes out, including the real reason General Harrison's so interested in a quiet barkeep in a frontier town." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Wesley's men had gone completely still, waiting for orders. Tom kept polishing glasses, but his every sense was alert, ready. Cooper had just changed the game entirely, and everyone in the room knew it. Wesley's practiced composure cracked for just a moment, revealing something darker beneath. "An interesting story, friend, but stories need proof to be believed." "Like the proof in Martinez's saddlebags?" Cooper took another drink, his eyes sharp despite his carefully maintained drunk act. "The ones your men haven't found yet? Interesting papers in those bags, letters, banking records, details about certain land purchases." Tom kept his face neutral, but his mind raced. He hadn't known about papers in Martinez's saddlebags. A glance in the mirror showed Sarah had quietly slipped out, hopefully to check this new information. Wesley's men had gone very still, that special stillness of predators, preparing to strike. But Cooper wasn't finished. "Or maybe," he continued, "like the proof buried under Anderson's old ranch, the one Harrison's men bought last month. Funny thing about that ranch, sits right over the old smuggling tunnels Collins gang used. Perfect. Place to hide, say, 200,000 in stolen gold." Tom's hands paused briefly in their eternal glass polishing. This was new information, even to him. Cooper was playing a dangerous game, revealing just enough to keep Wesley's men from acting while hinting at deeper secrets. "You seem very well informed," Wesley said softly, dangerously, "for a discharged captain. Amazing what you learn when people think you're just another drunk." Cooper's smile was sharp. Like the real reason Harrison wants this territory, not just about land speculation, is it? More about what's under the land, what those geological surveys found. The saloon. Doors swung open again. Sarah entered, her face carefully composed, but her eyes meeting Tom's in the mirror. A subtle nod confirmed Cooper's claim about the saddlebags. Wesley noticed the exchange. His casual mask slipped further, revealing the killer beneath. "I think it's time we—" The window exploded inward as a rider galloped past, firing wildly. Everyone dove for cover, everyone except Tom, who moved with fluid grace behind his bar. In the chaos, he saw Wesley's men draw hidden weapons, their true nature revealed. "Collins gang!" someone shouted from outside. "They're hitting the bank!" More gunfire erupted in the street. Wesley's men looked to their leader, suddenly uncertain. They had orders concerning the saloon, concerning Tom and Cooper, but a gang attack complicated things. "Go!" Wesley commanded. "Can't let them take those bank records." As his men rushed out, Wesley himself stayed behind, gun trained on Cooper. "Too many coincidences," he snarled. "The gang arriving just now, you showing up with your stories." Almost. Like it was planned. Cooper's drunk act had vanished entirely. "Maybe you're asking the wrong questions, Inspector, like why the Ghost Marshal really chose this town, this saloon, this exact location." Tom's hands moved to his notepad one final time. He held up the note for Wesley to read, because some ghosts remember everything, including what's buried beneath this building. Wesley's eyes widened as understanding hit. Just as the floor beneath his feet creaked in that specific way Tom had spent 5 years learning to recognize. "The Collins gang tunnels," Cooper said, softly. "They don't just run under Anderson's ranch, they run under this whole town, including this saloon, and some of us never stopped watching them." Outside, the gunfight intensified. But inside the Mockingbird, time seemed to freeze, as Wesley finally understood the full scope of the trap he'd walked into. The Ghost Marshal hadn't chosen this location by accident, hadn't spent 5 years serving drinks just to hide. He'd been guarding something, watching something, waiting for exactly this moment. Tom's hands moved away from his notepad, coming to rest precisely where they needed to be. Wesley saw the movement and began to turn, began to bring his gun to bear. But some ghosts are faster than others. The kind of ghosts that spend 5 years practicing every possible angle, every possible scenario, every perfect moment to strike. The kind of ghosts that never stop being what they are, even when pretending to be something else. The kind of ghosts that know patience is the deadliest weapon of all. The hidden door beneath Wesley's feet opened with a precision born of countless secret rehearsals. Before the fake inspector could react, 2 U.S. Marshals emerged from the tunnel, guns already drawn. Tom's hands hadn't moved from the bar, hadn't reached for his own weapons. He didn't need to. Like everything else in the past 5 years, this moment had been meticulously planned. Marshal Reed, one of the newcomers, introduced himself, relieving Wesley of his weapon. "Been waiting down there quite a while, Tom. Your timing's as perfect as ever." Tom nodded once, then wrote, "Whole gang accounted for. All 8 of Harrison's private militia, currently busy shooting at shadows in the street." Reed smiled grimly. "Collins' gang's not really attacking the bank. Just some old friends of yours creating a distraction." Wesley's face had gone ashen. 8? We only brought 6, plus the 2 watching the back door, Tom wrote. "You always post additional men for surveillance. Old habit from your days with Harrison's regular army unit, before he hired you for his private operations." Cooper stepped forward, drunk act completely gone. "See, that's the thing about ghosts. They watch, they learn, they remember." He pulled out a marshal's badge of his own. 5 years of documented evidence. Every move Harrison made, every land purchase, every corrupt deal. Tom's next note was longer. Knew you'd come eventually. Knew Harrison would want to expand his operation here. Chose this saloon specifically. Building sites over junction of 3 main smuggling tunnels. Perfect spot to monitor everything. The ghost marshal, Wesley whispered, finally understanding. You didn't retire here to hide. This whole thing, the quiet barkeep, the simple saloon owner, it was all just part of the hunt, Tom confirmed in writing. Longest operation of my career. 5 years of gathering evidence, documenting connections, waiting for Harrison to make his move. Sarah appeared in the doorway, looking satisfied. Martinez's saddlebags contained exactly what Captain Cooper said. Banking records, land deeds, letters in Harrison's own hand. More than enough to prove the conspiracy. And the real Collins gang members? Reed asked. 3 of them took our deal, Sarah replied. They're ready to testify about Harrison's involvement in the original payroll robbery. Turns out they didn't appreciate being betrayed by their army contact 5 years ago. Wesley slumped in defeat as more marshals emerged from the tunnel. Tom's next note was almost gentle. Did you really think I chose to lose my voice? Bullet was meant to kill me. Survived, adapted, found new ways to hunt. The geological surveys, Wesley said suddenly. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not just land speculation. Harrison found something in those mountains. Tom nodded. Gold deposits. Biggest strike in territory history. Been documenting everything while Harrison tried to quietly buy up every ranch, every claim, building his empire. But why wait 5 years, Wesley demanded. You had evidence before, needed proof of connection to original payroll robbery, Tom wrote. Needed Harrison to send men like you, prove he was still operating outside the law, needed everything to connect. A 5-year sting operation, Cooper said admiringly. Biggest in Marshal Service history, all run by a man who never spoke a word of it to anyone. Tom's final note of the exchange was simple. Some ghosts hunt best in silence. Outside, the fake gunfight was winding down. Harrison's men were in custody, the evidence was secured, and 5 years of careful planning had finally paid off. But Tom kept his position behind the bar, kept his hands in plain sight, because the most dangerous moment in any operation is when your target realizes they've lost everything, and Wesley still had one card left to play. Wesley moved like a rattler, fast, desperate, deadly. The knife appeared in his hand as if by magic, drawn from a hidden sheath with practiced efficiency. But instead of attacking, he grabbed Sarah, pulling her close as a shield. Nobody moves, he snarled, or the deputy joins the ghost marshal in permanent silence. Tom hadn't shifted his position behind the bar. His hands remained in plain sight, steady and calm. Only his eyes moved, tracking angles in the mirror with mathematical precision. Smart, Wesley said, noting Tom's stillness. You know how fast I am with a blade, famous for it in certain circles. Harrison's personal specialist for quiet problems, Tom wrote unhurriedly. Known about knife since you walked in. Boots too heavy. On right side, favored your left arm. Obvious tells. Knowing doesn't help you stop it, Wesley pressed the blade closer to Sarah's throat. Now here's what's going to happen. Marshal Reed and his men are going to clear out of those tunnels. Captain Cooper is going to burn those documents, and you... He never finished. Sarah moved exactly as Tom had trained her these past months, exactly as they'd practiced in secret dawn sessions behind the saloon. A precise shift of weight, a practiced twist, and suddenly Wesley's knife hand was locked in a joint hold Tom had shown her specifically for this scenario. Tom's next note was almost casual. Taught her that 3 months ago, day after I identified. You as Harrison's likely cleaner, been preparing her ever since. Wesley struggled, but Sarah's hold was perfect. Impossible, he gasped. How could you know? Ghost Marshal's greatest weapon isn't speed, Tom wrote. It's preparation. Watched Harrison's organization for 5 years, learned his patterns, knew he'd send his knife specialist when time came. You trained her specifically. To counter me? Wesley's voice held disbelief as Reed moved in to secure him. Spent months preparing her just for this moment? Tom nodded, then wrote, "Same way I prepared everything else. Chose Sarah as deputy because saw potential. Taught her specific skills would need. Positioned everyone exactly where they had to be." Cooper whistled softly. The whole thing, the saloon's location, the deputy's training, the tunnel surveillance. You've spent 5 years building the perfect trap. Not trap, Tom corrected in writing. Justice. As Wesley was disarmed and secured, Sarah turned to Tom. You knew. All those dawn training sessions, those specific holds and counter moves you insisted I learn. You were preparing me to face him specifically. Tom's response was direct. Needed someone I could trust, someone Harrison didn't know, someone who could play vital role when moment came. That's why you really recommended me for deputy, she realized. Not just because I investigated the land sales, but because you knew Harrison would eventually send Wesley, knew you'd need someone trained to stop him, saw your potential. Same way old Marshall saw mine years ago. Cycle continues. Reed and his men began coordinating with more marshals arriving from the tunnels. The evidence was overwhelming. Harrison's conspiracy was exposed at every level. His land-buying scheme, his connection to the original payroll robbery, his use of the Collins gang, all of it documented through 5 years of patient observation. Wesley watched Tom with a mixture of fear and revelation. 5 years. Playing. The simple barkeep, training deputies, monitoring tunnels, gathering evidence, all while letting us think we were the ones watching you. Tom's final note of the exchange carried the weight of absolute certainty. Ghost Marshal earned name by being invisible, by watching, waiting, preparing. He turned to Sarah, who stood straight and proud, every inch the deputy he'd trained her to be. His next words were for her alone, ready for what comes next, because Harrison himself would be arriving soon, following his failed cleaning crew. And Tom had spent 5 years preparing for that confrontation most of all. Sunset was approaching again. The same time of day, Harrison's men had first entered the Mockingbird 24 hours ago. Tom stood at his usual position behind the bar, but now the pretense of the simple barkeep had been shed completely. His gun belt hung low on his hips, the twin Colts seeming to absorb what little light remained. Marshal Reed's men had taken positions throughout the town, hidden in the buildings and tunnels Tom had spent years mapping. Sarah stood by the window, watching the street with new confidence. Her training hadn't just been about facing Wesley. Tom had prepared her for everything that was coming. "Rider coming," she announced. "Single horse from Fort Laramie direction." Tom nodded. "Right on schedule." He wrote Harrison's scout. "Always sends one ahead to test response." Cooper checked his weapon. "Want us to take him?" "No, let him see exactly what we want him to see." The rider passed slowly down the main street, taking in the obvious martial presence, the armed townspeople, the captured members of Harrison's private militia being loaded into reinforced wagons. Everything exactly as Tom had planned for Harrison to learn. "He's heading back," Sarah reported, "riding hard." Tom's next note was precise. "Harrison will come at nightfall. 30 men, based on patrol patterns observed past 5 years, will split into 3 groups. You know his tactics that well?" Reed asked. "Studied every military operation he commanded. Man like Harrison relies on what worked before. Predictable." "That's why you had us position men in specific buildings," Sarah realized. "You know exactly where he'll put his forces." Tom nodded, writing, "First group will secure bank. High ground, good firing positions. Second, will move through tunnels and try to flank defenders. Third, he'll lead himself straight down Main Street. Classic hammer and anvil," Cooper observed. "Pin us down with fire from the bank, hit us from below, then crush us with main force. Exactly what he did in 3 previous." Operations always work same way. But this time we know it's coming, Sarah said with growing understanding. This time we're ready. Tom's smile held no humor. 5 years of preparation, every building reinforced, every tunnel mapped, every angle covered. Reed studied the quiet man who had orchestrated all this. Ghost Marshal indeed. You didn't just watch Harrison's operation. You built an entire town into a trap specifically designed to counter his tactics. Justice takes patience, Tom wrote, takes planning, takes understanding your prey completely. And Harrison? Cooper asked. Man still dangerous. Military genius, they used to say. Tom's response was cold. Genius has patterns. Patterns become predictable. Predictable becomes vulnerable. Sarah checked her weapons again, not just her. Standard deputy's revolver, but the specific backup pieces Tom had insisted she learn to use. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Every possible move he could make. Not everything, Tom admitted in writing. Man like Harrison cornered becomes truly dangerous. We'll have contingencies we don't know about. But that's why you stayed. In character even after Wesley was captured, Reed realized. Let him think he'd figured out the whole plot. Let him report back to Harrison that it was just about the payroll robbery and land deals. Tom nodded. Let him think he knows full scope. Truth is bigger. Bigger how? Sarah asked. Before Tom could respond, more riders were spotted approaching from the fort. Just a few, well ahead of the main force, officers coming to negotiate, exactly as Harrison had done in his previous operations. Right on schedule, Tom wrote. Always sends negotiators first, offers deals, tries to divide opposition. You want us to refuse them? Reed asked. Tom's smile was predatory. Want you to invite them in. Let them see the saloon, the tunnels, everything we want, Harrison, to know about, because there's something he needs to think he's figured out, Sarah said slowly. Something that will make him commit to attacking exactly the way you want him to. Smart deputy, Tom wrote, getting as good at strategy as you are with that gun. Learn from the best, she replied. Ghost Marshal's been teaching me more than just fighting moves. The negotiators were almost to the town now. Tom took his position behind the bar, but this time there was no pretense of the quiet barkeep. Now he stood as what he truly was, the Ghost Marshal who had spent 5 years building the perfect trap. Let Harrison think he knew what he was riding into. Let him think he had understood the game. The real truth was something far deadlier, and by sunrise, everyone would know why some ghosts were best left undisturbed. The negotiators played their parts exactly as Tom had predicted. 3 officers, all wearing polished uniforms and practiced expressions of reasonable authority. They listened to the charges, examined the evidence, and made their expected offers. Of compromise, General Harrison is prepared to be generous, Major Parker, their spokesman, announced. Full pardons for any civilians involved, compensation for the town, a chance to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Tom wrote his response with deliberate care. Same offer he made in Tucson, before ordering town burned. The Major's expression tightened slightly. That was never proven. Was there? Tom's next note cut him off. Watched from hills, while Harrison's men torched buildings, killed witnesses, buried truth. Then you know what he's capable of, Parker pressed. Why risk your town, your people? Surely there's room for... Tom held up a new note. No deals, no compromises, no more buried truth. As the negotiators left, Sarah watched them through the window. They saw everything you wanted them to see, the defensive positions, the armed townspeople, the captured men. Tom nodded, writing, "Will report exactly what Harrison expects. Force deployed exactly as predicted. Tunnels apparently secured. Town, seemingly prepared for his standard tactics." Seemingly, Reed asked. Harrison's smart, will know visible defenses are obvious. Will look for hidden trap. And he'll find it, Cooper said with growing understanding. Or rather, he'll find the trap you want him to find. the one that makes him think he's cleverer than us." Tom's smile was cold. Man like Harrison needs to feel superior, need him thinking he's seen through our strategy. Sarah studied her mentor with new appreciation. "That's why you let Wesley see the tunnel network, why you made sure Harrison's scouts spotted our defensive positions. You're showing him exactly what you want him to see. Every general fights best when thinking he has advantage." The sun was sinking toward the horizon now, painting the street in shades of amber and shadow. Tom's next note was precise. "Harrison will come at full dark. 37 men, not 30. Keep 7-man squad in reserve always." "You can predict his numbers that exactly?" Reed wondered. "Watched every operation past 5 years. Man's consistent, predictable, fatal flaw for commander." The marshal whistled softly. The Ghost Marshal's reputation wasn't just about being fast with a gun, was it? This is how you really worked, learning everything about your target, understanding them better than they understand themselves. Tom wrote, "Gun's just tool. Real. Weapon is patience, preparation, understanding." Sarah moved away from the window. "They're coming. Dust cloud from Fort Laramie direction. Looks like—" She paused, counting. 37 riders. The ghost of a smile touched Tom's face as he wrote, "Right on schedule. Reed, get your men in position. Cooper, coordinate tunnel. Defense. Sarah," she straightened, ready for her role. "I remember the plan, everything you've trained me for." "Trust you," Tom wrote simply. Then to everyone, "Remember, let them think initial assault succeeds. Let Harrison believe his tactical genius has prevailed. Truth is best weapon when revealed at perfect moment." The others moved to their positions, each understanding their part in the intricate trap Tom had spent 5 years preparing. Outside, the approaching hoofbeats grew louder as Harrison's force neared the town. Tom took his place behind the bar one final time, but now the position was purely tactical. Every angle calculated, every line of fire considered, every possible scenario accounted for. The quiet barkeep was gone completely, replaced by the legend that had haunted outlaw nightmares for years. His last note before the coming storm was simple. "Some ghosts are patient. Some ghosts are precise. Some ghosts spend 5 years building perfect trap." He adjusted his gun belt slightly, feeling the familiar weight of the Colts. In the mirror, he could see Sarah take her final position, Reed's men sliding into their hidden spots, Cooper's team ready in the tunnels, everything exactly as planned, everything exactly where it needed to be. Let Harrison come with his superior tactics, his overwhelming force, his absolute certainty of victory. Let him think he had understood the game, had seen through the Ghost Marshal's strategy. The truth was far deadlier. And by morning, everyone would understand why some legends were best left to rest. Harrison's men came exactly as Tom had predicted. The first wave struck the bank, laying down covering fire that seemed to pin down Reed's defenders. The second force emerged from the tunnels exactly where expected, apparently flanking the town's defense. And down the main street rode Harrison himself, every inch the commanding general, leading his primary force straight toward the Mockingbird Saloon. Tom watched it all in his mirror, counting seconds, tracking movements, every shot, every position, every tactical decision unfolding precisely as he'd planned. "They've taken the bank," came the planned shout from Reed's men, selling the deception. "Falling back! Tunnels are breached!" Cooper's voice carried the perfect note of desperate command. "They're behind us!" Harrison sat his horse in the middle of the street, exactly where Tom had calculated he would stop. The general's smile was visible even in the fading light, the satisfied expression of a tactical genius watching his perfect strategy unfold. "Ghost Marshal!" Harrison's voice boomed with authority. "Your trap has failed. My men control the high ground, the tunnels, and your escape routes. Surrender now, and I'll still honor the terms offered by my negotiators." Tom's response was to step out onto the saloon's porch, hands empty and visible. In the dying sunlight, he looked almost ordinary. except for his eyes. Those eyes had haunted Harrison's nightmares for 5 years. No note. Harrison's smile widened. No written response. Finally accepting the reality of your situation? Tom's hands moved, not to his guns, but to his notepad. Reality isn't always what it seems, General. Still playing games? Harrison laughed. Look around you, Ghost. Your trap failed. My tactical expertise prevailed. I understood your strategy completely. Did you? Tom's next note was held high enough for everyone to read. Did you really think I spent 5 years preparing such an obvious trap? That's when Harrison heard it, the sound of rifles being cocked. Not from the bank, not from the tunnels, but from every window, every rooftop, every shadowed doorway on the street. His men in the bank and tunnels had gone suspiciously quiet. Impossible, Harrison breathed. My scouts saw your defensive positions. My negotiators confirmed, saw what I wanted them to see. Tom's note cut him off. Obvious trap. Hiding real trap. Oldest strategy in book. The bank. Harrison spun in his saddle. My men were captured the moment they entered. Reed's voice carried from above. Ghost Marshal spent 5 years redesigning that building. Every entrance a trap. Every window a kill box. The tunnels. Harrison's composure cracked. My second force. Walking into prepared positions, Cooper emerged from a shadowed doorway. 5 years of mapping every tunnel, every junction. Your men never had a chance. Sarah stepped onto the porch beside Tom, her badge catching the last light. 5 years of preparation, General. Not just gathering evidence, not just documenting. Your corruption. The Ghost Marshal was building the perfect tactical trap, using your own predictability against you. Harrison's face twisted with rage. My reserve force, 7 men waiting in the gully east of town. Tom's note appeared, already surrounded. You're consistent, General. Always hold same size reserve. Always position them same way. You can't. Harrison's hand dropped to his gun. You couldn't have predicted everything. Tom's next note carried 5 years of patient certainty. Didn't have to predict everything. Just had to predict you. Harrison was a proud man, a decorated officer, used to being the smartest commander on any battlefield. But now he saw it all, how his own tactical preferences had become a weapon against him, how his consistency had become predictability, how 5 years of careful observation had turned his every strength into a weakness. Impossible, he whispered again. No one could plan something this intricate, this perfect. Tom's final note before the shooting started was simple. Ghost Marshal earned name by being patient, by watching, by understanding prey completely. Harrison was fast, decorated officer, experienced gunfighter, survivor of countless battles. His draw was a blur of practiced motion, but some ghosts are faster still. And Tom had spent 5 years practicing every possible angle of this exact moment. Harrison's gun had barely cleared leather when Tom moved. 5 years of practice, of rehearsing this exact moment, distilled into a single, perfect motion. His first shot took Harrison's gun, spinning it away with surgical precision. His second struck the general's horse's saddle, causing the animal to rear, exactly as Tom had trained it to do over months of carefully orchestrated encounters on the trail. But Harrison wasn't finished. He pulled a hidden derringer, exactly the model Tom had predicted he'd carry, in exactly the place he'd calculated it would be. The general's smile was triumphant as he aimed at the seemingly exposed Ghost Marshal. Some things you couldn't predict. He started. Tom's third shot took the derringer before Harrison could fire, while his fourth caught the general's sword. He belted, dropping the ceremonial saber he'd been reaching for with his other hand. Each shot precisely placed, each one proving that the legend of the Ghost Marshal had been earned through more than just speed. Impossible, Harrison breathed again, staring at his empty hands. Nobody's that fast, nobody's that precise. Tom's notepad appeared, not about speed, about knowing your opponent completely. Every weapon, every move, every fallback plan. Sarah stepped forward, her own gun trained steadily on the general. 5 years of studying you, sir. Every habit, every pattern, every preference. The Ghost Marshal knew you'd carry a Derringer as backup, knew which model you'd choose based on your military records, knew exactly where you'd place it from observing. You at military reviews. The sword. Harrison's voice cracked. How did you know about the sword? Collection of Civil War sabers, Tom wrote. Always wear one with dress uniform. Always reach left hand when primary weapon lost. Pattern, predictable. Reed and his marshals moved in to take the general into custody, but Harrison wasn't done. His face contorted with desperate rage. You think this ends here? You think you've won? I have connections, influence, power. Tom's next note cut him off. Had connections, had power, evidence already sent to territorial governor, to War Department, to newspapers. Every corrupt deal, Cooper added, emerging with the last of Harrison's captured men. Every land grab, every murdered witness, and most importantly, proof of your connection to the original payroll robbery, the one that started all this. The money. Harrison's eyes darted to the tunnels. You never found it. No one could have found it 3 years ago, Tom wrote, under Anderson's ranch. Left it there. Needed you to keep thinking it was safe. Needed you to keep operating normally. Sarah holstered her weapon. The Ghost Marshal wasn't just gathering evidence. He was letting you dig your grave deeper. Every new crime documented, every corrupt deal recorded, building a case no amount of influence could bury. Harrison sagged in defeat as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. But then he straightened, one last card to play. The newspapers, the territorial governor. They'll never believe. He stopped as Tom held up his final note. Already do, because wasn't working alone. Never was. As if on cue, more riders appeared at the end of the street. Territorial officials, newspaper editors, even a federal judge, all summoned secretly over the past weeks, all positioned to witness Harrison's fall firsthand. My God, Harrison whispered. The negotiators, the scouts, even them seeing the defensive positions. All of it was part of larger plan, Tom confirmed in writing. Needed witnesses beyond law enforcement, needed power structure to see corruption exposed, needed truth to be undeniable. The Ghost Marshal's greatest weapon was never his speed, Sarah said quietly. It was his patience, his understanding, his ability to see every angle, predict every move, prepare for every possibility. As Harrison was led away, his entire corrupt empire collapsing around him, Tom remained on the porch of his saloon. 5 years of patience, of planning, of precise preparation had finally paid off. Justice had been served, not through quick draws and gunfights, but through careful strategy and perfect execution. What now? Sarah asked her mentor. With Harrison's conspiracy exposed, with justice done, will you leave? Go back to being the Ghost Marshal full-time? Tom's response was thoughtful. Some ghosts find peace in silence. Some find purpose in staying still. Some find justice in watching, waiting, protecting. He gestured to the saloon, to the town, to the position he'd chosen so carefully 5 years ago. This wasn't just a hiding place anymore. It was a watchtower, a guardian post, a place where justice could be served one careful observation at a time. The Ghost Marshal had never truly retired. He'd just found a different way to hunt. A month after Harrison's fall, the Mockingbird Saloon settled back into its quiet routine. Tom stood behind his bar, polishing glasses with the same precise care he always showed. But now, everyone understood the meaning behind those careful movements, the purpose behind that methodical attention to detail. The newspaper sat on the bar, headlines still proclaiming Harrison's conviction. The evidence had been overwhelming. 5 years of documented corruption, witnessed by territorial officials and published in papers across the frontier. The general, who had thought himself untouchable, was now serving life in prison, along with every member of his conspiracy. Sarah entered, wearing her deputy's badge with new confidence. She no longer needed dawn training sessions behind the saloon, but she came anyway, understanding that there was always more to learn from the quiet man who had chosen to make redemption his watchtower. "Riders coming," she announced, but her tone was casual. "New settlers, looks like. Town's growing since word spread about the gold deposits." Tom nodded, writing, "Honest folk now. No more corrupt land grabs, no more buried secrets. Some secrets are still worth keeping," she smiled. "Like how the legendary ghost marshal chooses to serve drinks and keep watch over a quiet frontier town." His response was simple. Some ghosts find peace in silence, but they both knew it was more than that. The Mockingbird wasn't just a saloon anymore, it was a symbol. A reminder that justice sometimes worked best from the shadows, that the most effective guardian was the one nobody suspected, that some legends were best kept alive through quiet service rather than loud action. Tom's hands moved across his notepad. One final time, town needs protecting, needs watching, needs someone patient enough to see trouble coming. "And a deputy to help?" Sarah asked. His smile was answer enough. The ghost marshal had found his peace, not in retirement, but in transformation. He had become something new, part legend, part guardian, part quiet barkeep who saw everything and said nothing. The setting sun painted Redemption's main street gold, just as it had the day 3 prisoners made the mistake of mocking a quiet saloon owner. But now that quiet was different. It wasn't the silence of a hidden legend, but the peace of a guardian who had found his true purpose. Some ghosts, after all, serve justice best by simply watching, waiting, and keeping their stories in the shadows where they belong,